Supporting Trauma-Informed Practices, a Community Approach. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded, and we invite all of you to go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat box. Okay, my name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be primarily behind the scenes helping with today's conversation. I did want to invite you to take a look at our various housekeeping tips, referring to the use of the chat and Q&A box, as well as the resources and recording being shared later this week, and a few brief polls throughout the session. Before we begin, I would like to invite all of you to follow us on social media. On Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third. On Facebook, follow us at Campaign for GLR. And on LinkedIn, follow us at Campaign for GLR as well. Please tweet using the hashtags GLR Reading and hashtag Learning Tuesdays to share any thoughts you may have from the session. Additionally, I would like to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Later this afternoon at 3 p.m., we have a session, Easier Said Than Done, Advancing the Science of Reading as the New Normal. Next week on September 20th, we have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a funder-to-funder conversation at 12:30 on re-envisioning school staffing, and a parent-teacher home visits and the power of trusting relationships, 25 years of impact. On September 27th, we'll have an exciting peer exchange conversation on deepening school community collaboration to support children and families, First 10 Partnerships in Action. Registration and more information for these exciting sessions will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope that you can join us. Joining you now is Malai Amfar, Senior Consultant with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming today. My name is Malai Amfar, and I'm Senior Program Officer with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Today, we are revisiting the topic of resilience in our communities and how this is connected with our shared work through the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Trauma and chronic stress potentially impact our priorities of school readiness, school attendance, summer slide, family success, grade level reading, and assurances towards learning loss recovery. We did explore these topics during our GLR week and revisit them again today. Our Resilient Lehigh Valley is a collective impact initiative connected with our friends at Lehigh Valley Reads. Our presenters are leaders from Resilient Lehigh Valley, and we will learn about the community-wide trauma-informed practices they use across multiple sectors. Beth Tomlinson, Senior Director of Education with United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley and co-founder of Resilient Lehigh Valley is moderating this session today. And I do encourage everyone to take a look at the bios. We have quite a lineup of panelists and presenters today. We would like to open this session with a video, which I would like Sierra to share, and then we'll roll right into the conversation. Thank you.
Taught for 13 years. So although like thousands of kids that you've had interactions with, sometimes I made judgments about a kid and their disconnect from me or disconnect from a classroom. And I never stopped to ask, hey, what's going on? When you ask those questions and you find out, and then sometimes you look at a kid and you're like, wow, you're here today. And I'm so proud of you that you're here today. And then some kids will look at you and go, because this is the best place to be, and I'd rather be here than what I have to deal with when I'm outside of school.
Students who are struggling with something may explode in school or may shut down in school. And many of those students, it's because things are happening in their lives. It could be at home, it could be in the community.
I remember like it was yesterday going out to Pittsburgh to a college fair, and we had red bags that we gave them. They left the bags. And I asked the student, why did you leave your bag? And they said, because we live in CRIP territory.
I had another girl that wrote, I have moved 7 times in 7 years. I have learned to not exist. You cannot see inside a human's brain. And when you cannot see inside a human's brain, we make assumptions that a behavior is deliberate, when sometimes the child has got so much stress that they're brain has been wired differently.
We know that exposure to adverse childhood experiences reshapes the brain in some really critical ways. Parts of the brain that are responsible for decision making, regulation of emotion and behaviors, parts of the brain that are responsible for attention. And so when these parts of the brain are influenced in these negative ways, it could have potentially much more negative effects than when trauma is experienced by an adult.
What we identified at our United Way was at the root cause of all those difficult, complex social problems that we were addressing is exposure to childhood trauma. So the best way to support families and support our communities is really by addressing trauma early and building trauma-informed systems to break the cycle of family and community violence and build resilient communities. Resilient Lehigh Valley is a multi-sector partnership of organizations and community members dedicated to our mission of building a trauma-informed and resilient Lehigh Valley through education and collaboration. So through that, we've organized about 100 different organizations and growing, about 160 members and growing, are actively engaged in supporting trauma-informed work.
The heart of a trauma-informed school is the power of a relationship.
Being in trauma-informed school is focusing on the basic needs of our students, making sure they feel safe, that they feel connected.
Your job as educators are not to cure trauma. Our job is to help students through it.
Big things in trauma-informed practices is the way you set up your room. Instead of having rows, you have more clusters and groups so the room doesn't feel so large.
I often would have students be sent to the office because they needed a timeout from the classroom, and now that they have a peace corner, if they need a break, they kind of have that self-regulation ability to kind of go take a break and get back to learning when they're ready.
The main thing is building relationships with kids, resiliency in kids, and the skills that they need to cope with the situation that they're dealing with.
Our students are going through a lot. There are things that are happening in their lives that are so egregious for some of them that they're not going to openly tell you about it. Once you form relationships with kids, once they feel connected to you, many of our kids will tell you. Many of our kids really want to have that conversation.
Our hope with Resilient LV is to create a trauma-informed, resilient community.
We know that Black kids, Latino kids are punished at much greater rates. When we address trauma, we're able to address racial disparities. The shift will be from punishing the kids to actually helping them grow. And when we help them grow, they'll be less likely to repeat the problem behavior, more likely to actually persist in school. We're going to see kids who are going to be able to contribute to the workforce of the Lehigh Valley. Trauma-informed schools can serve as a model for the justice system, for the health system. And in so doing, we'll see healthier and safer communities.
The best benefit of being a trauma-informed school is that we are creating an environment where our students can be the most successful that they can, all of our students.
I've come to understand how much of an epidemic we're in. We've become a safe haven for a lot of our students to just begin to navigate some of the things that they're experiencing.
The best way to trump an adverse childhood experience is a stable, caring adult. We were saying, like, at least someone in your house is caring. We were using those phrases all the time when our students didn't need to hear the at least. What our students needed to hear was, that's a lot that you're telling us. We can't really take some of that away, but what we can do is help you carry it.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Beth Tomlinson with the United Way of Greater Lehigh Valley and co-founder of Resilient Lehigh Valley. And I just want to thank the Campaign for Grade Level Reading folks for allowing us this opportunity to share some of our youth resiliency building efforts with this community. And I think that video speaks for itself. Interestingly enough, that video was created quite a few years ago. So some of our work has changed and evolved since then, and excited to share some of those evolutions. But that was created well before COVID. I think today we're much more cognizant as a nation, and certainly as those who are consider themselves child advocates and educators, that we're in the midst of a youth mental health crisis. whether it's from family, community trauma, racial identity trauma, harmful effects of social media that we better understand now, bullying, or even existential threats of climate change and political discourse and dialogue in our community today. Our children are really struggling, and our parents are struggling to meet needs, and as well as our educators are struggling as well. So what can we do to help? What can we do about this? Today, we're going to share some of the ways that Resilient Lehigh Valley is helping to promote hope, healing, and resiliency in our children and families. And we're excited to share this with you, and look forward to questions at the end of our sharing. So just to begin, what is Resilient Lehigh Valley? We could go to that first slide. Yeah, next slide. Thanks. So Resilient Lehigh Valley is a collective impact initiative to promote hope, healing from trauma in youth, families, and community through trauma-informed practices and systems. We're doing this through raising awareness on the impact of trauma, particularly adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, racial trauma, community, historical trauma, providing trainings on trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices. And just to kind of ground us in the language, from a Resilient Lehigh Valley perspective, when we say trauma-informed, we also mean culturally responsive. Trauma-informed and culturally responsive are two strands of the same braided rope. We really can't be trauma-informed without being culturally responsive, and vice versa. Resilient Lehigh Valley is also supporting organizations and sectors to adopt a trauma-informed approach as an organizational framework, increasing collaboration and information resource sharing, really working to break down silos between systems, increasing protective factors in communities most impacted by trauma, as well as advocating for trauma-informed policies, legislation, and funding both at the local, state, and federal level. So today, it's interesting, always interesting seeing that video at the start. Today, we have over 1,000, I think I said maybe 100 partners. Today, we have over 1,000 coalition members across multiple sectors. We're working in both education, human services, law enforcement, and healthcare. We've trained over 15,000 parents and helping professionals in trauma-informed practices and culture response practices. And we've inspired a regional trauma-informed and culture responsive movement within our helping sectors in the Lehigh Valley. Next slide. And that's not how we started. So many years in, we're at that 1,000 coalition movement and some behavioral change and systems change, but that is not how we started, right? How we started really was born out of our investments as a United Way in both community schools and grade level reading. Through the community school framework, we assumed that by providing wraparound services and supports along with dedicated community school staffing in a high poverty, low performing school, we would see some of those whole school positive changes in attendance, behavior, and academics. And yet in schools where we were embedding really robust wraparound services, mentors, tutors, after school programs, health services, family basic need resources, we weren't really seeing that whole school change in attendance, behavior, and academics that we thought we would. So we started to dig a bit deeper to see what was really going on. What pieces of this puzzle were we missing? And we walked away with two key pieces of learning. One, our teachers weren't necessarily trained in the newest, most evidence-based science of reading instruction to really pinpoint which foundational components of literacy each student may need and then teach those skills. And second, our school staff weren't aware of the impact that childhood trauma, also known as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, played in their classroom, how they saw and responded to student behavior, the learning environment they created in the classroom, the types of relationships they built with their students, and how student behavior might trigger their own trauma histories. So our third grade reading initiative, called Lehigh Valley Reads, began advocating for Pennsylvania educators to be trained in the science of reading, right? So LV Reads took that literacy instruction component, and with Resilient Lehigh Valley, right, we took hold of the trauma-informed movement piece. We began training educators on average childhood experiences, ACEs, and what a trauma-informed school approach looked like. We started with about 10 community partners around a conference table at our United Way office, trying to figure out how to get educators to buy into this training, which was really a huge paradigm shift for many educators and district leaders at the time. Trying to how to figure out how we would secure funding to be able to provide the trainings. And as we continued planning and training schools and getting more buy-in, more and more partners started to join this effort. And our small group of community partners started to grow and diversify, right? And what started with 10 people, 10 partners around a table, quickly became a movement in our community to really create, build youth resiliency, family resiliency, community resiliency, and also the resiliency of our helping professionals, right? So we're really excited today to share just some of the projects that we've been working on that we thought would be most helpful to the Campaign for Grade Level Reading audience. And with that segue, I want to introduce Dr. Chris Liang, Chairperson for the Department of Education and Human Services and Professor of Counseling Psychology in the College of Education at Lehigh University. We are blessed to have Chris as part of our Resilient Lehigh Valley executive team and a key trainer and coach in both a trauma-informed and culturally responsive school model. And Chris is really going to ground us in what trauma is, how it affects the brain, behavior, and learning outcomes, and why a trauma-informed and culturally responsive school approach is so important. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Beth. I also want to thank the National Campaign for Grade Level Reading, as well as our incredible partners on this panel, including Resilient Lehigh Valley and the United Way of the Greater Lehigh Valley, for the opportunity to join you all today. I also want to thank all the educators for all you do every day and for joining us on this webinar today. Now, long before the beginning of COVID, educators like those of you in this webinar had begun to notice several alarming trends that have only been exacerbated by the pandemic, the political discord, and racial conflict that Beth spoke about earlier. That is, teachers like yourselves have noticed that some things weren't quite right with our kids today. Something was just a little bit askew. That's what researchers and a growing number of educators had also noted, right? That youth are evidencing more externalizing behavioral problems, they're internalizing more, and they have more mental health problems. Indeed, our national data show an increase in mental health problems and a pretty steep curve and learning loss, for which educators are like yourselves are working really hard to get youth caught up. Now, I'm of the mindset that we can't rush this process by simply pouring in more resources. Certainly resources help and they're needed, and our federal government and state governments can certainly devote more resources to help support teachers and leaders and students and families. But I think we need to use those resources in a way that also reflects the experiences of youth and their families. Change slide, please. The role of stress and trauma need to be considered strongly as we confront these problems with mental health and academic problems that we're seeing. We know that social emotional wellness and academic performance are interrelated. We've got years of research showing that kids who are well do well academically, and that certainly feeds into their mental health as well. We know that when kids are exposed to strong social emotional learning curriculum that are delivered with fidelity, kids do better on test scores and such. I'm certainly a little bit more concerned about the mental health aspects of things. I'm a psychologist after all, but I'm also engaged in this work because I know that mental health is so important to the academic well-being of kids, keeping them engaged. So we have an opportunity right now to change how we do things. We're 30 months into this pandemic, I think, and we still have the opportunity to shift how we operate. It takes a little bit of knowledge and a huge shift in mindset. It takes retraining our brains to do things a little differently, but those little things can result in huge, huge payoffs. So what are kids experiencing? I started this slide by talking about stress and trauma, and typical youth stressors are things that we all experience as kids, right? We all experience things, troubling moments or stress when it came to social relationships. We all experienced struggles with our identity development, and that may be more challenging for those of us from minoritized groups, LGBTQ individuals, people of color, immigrant groups, women. We experience these stressors just like everyone else, but maybe with just a little bit more struggle because of the stigma that our groups have carried. But we also experience academic stressors. All of these things are typical. All these things are things that we've all experienced. Some of these things are really quite important to mental health, of course. Kids need sleep if they're focused on academics, which they should be, but if they're focused on their academics and if they're engaged socially, all throughout the night, they're not necessarily going to be sleeping and helping their brains rest and restore. But that's just part of the problem. Next slide, please. While many of us experience those everyday stressors, a good number of us also experience what researchers call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences. And this is what we're going to be focusing on today. These stress loads are pretty heavy on kids. They've been heavy on all of us, adults and kids alike. And it's something that we've all had to pay attention to. And unfortunately, some of us are even feeling burned out by talking about stress even, right? But it's something that we need to continue doing. So we're going to talk about ACEs a little bit and its impacts on the brain. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know, ACEs have been defined primarily as household trauma, comprised of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, and a number of household dysfunctions, including things like substance abuse problems in the home, mental health problems in the home, or homes where there is divorce or violence, or where there's a parent who's been incarcerated. Those are some of the traditional ACEs or conventional ACEs that researchers have been studying for quite some time. More recently, researchers have highlighted that there are other types of experiences that youth encounter that are also that can also be counted as adversity. And we're talking about things like racial discrimination, bullying, community and neighborhood violence, and experience with the foster care system. So there's a lot of different types of ACEs that people experience, and it cuts across different racial groups, it cuts different economic groups. It's something that we all can experience. It doesn't discriminate in that way. However, research does indicate that BIPOC folks and people living in poverty are more likely to experience more types of ACEs than their peer groups who are not people of color, who are not living in poverty. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. And when you look at this list that's on your on that graphic of the different types of ACEs, I just want you to reflect a little bit on that list, right? And I think what you'll see in all of those ACEs is that they can each contribute to a sense of instability and insecurity in youth. And this is a critical point that I want to get back to later, but I wanted to highlight how the experience of ACE is not just something that we passively encounter. It is something that is dynamic, right? We experience it, we react to it biologically, psychologically, socially, and depending on the types of environments that we later on are in, those experiences can be heightened. Those negative experiences can be heightened, or they can be mitigated. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. But the ACEs, the pathway of ACEs to the negative outcomes that we're so concerned about as educators and health professionals is determined by an interplay of biological, psychological, school, neighborhood, and policy and family factors. All of these things all play a role. And I want to be really clear about that, because some of us want to just focus on fixing the kids. And our work has been about addressing kids and helping them with skill development, but also about fixing systems. And that's going to be really critical in all the work that you hear later on today. You're going to be hearing our colleagues talk about the purposeful and strategic attention that they've paid to intervening at different levels to mitigate the effects of trauma. What I want to simply say, because it's my task to just explain to you the role of trauma in education and well-being, is that, trauma has an effect on the individual first, right? And that trauma is affecting first the physiological operations or functioning of the individual child. When any of us experiences stress or life-threatening stress, we can feel it physiologically, right? Like, think about the last time you experienced high levels of stress. You could feel it in your body. You could feel your heart racing. You could feel it happening to your body. Well, it's also happening to your brain, right? Your brain is actually what is causing all these reactions that the rest of your body is experiencing. The brain is releasing cortisol, and that's super important. Many of us know that. The cortisol is going to help us survive. It's meant to help the organism survive. It's the brain's primary objective, right? To survive above all else is super important. So the cortisol is released and the organism either fights or it flees or it freezes or maybe even fawns, right? But all of that is designed to protect the organism. It's to help the organism survive another day. Now, while that's really important in the short term, a child who is exposed to high levels and chronic levels of conventional or the expanded ACEs is more likely to experience the negative outcomes because of the cortisol, right? The cortisol helps in the short term, but it can dysregulate the parts of the brain that are responsible for emotion regulation, decision-making, attention, memory, and mental health, right? Check that list I just read off there. And think about your classrooms, think about your school buildings: emotion regulation, decision-making, attention, memory, and mental health, right? Super, super important for us as educators. If we want to make any difference when it comes to the learning loss, we're going to have to pay attention to these factors. Next slide, please. I think, yeah. So thanks. So what happens exactly with the brain? Because I could talk real generally and broadly about the brain, but what we've learned is that it's helpful to communicate to educators and students what is exactly happening to the brain, right? So here are some things that are happening. With the amygdala, it increases in size, right? And the amygdala is the automotion center of the brain. It's the primitive center of the brain. And what it's designed to do, or what it can do, or what it does do, is it helps to ensure the protection of the individual. It scans for danger in the environment, and it protects the self against the threats that it perceives from the environment. And when a person is experiencing high levels of trauma, a smell or a slight can trigger a memory that can cue these fears of fears that the individual child may have, right? So a simple tone change or a look, a comment, a smell that a teacher has can put this child in a state of dysregulation. Now, the amygdala grows in size with every single encounter with stress and trauma, especially when there isn't a nurturing environment to help calm it down. Now, this can help to explain some of the reactive aggression or defiance that we see in classrooms. It can help to explain the manipulation or the internalizing behaviors that we see, right? The kid putting their head down so that they can't be seen and be hurt by other people. There are other parts of the brain that are also implicated. The hippocampus experiences a reduction in size as energy is diverted to growing the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala is about survival. It's survival first. So the hippocampus reduces in size in favor of the amygdala for the purpose of survival. But when that happens, it makes it more difficult for the individual to focus attention and memorize material. That's one of the primary functions of the hippocampus, right? So we need that hippocampus operating so that the child can pay attention, focus, and memorize things that we need them to memorize for their academic performance. The development of the prefrontal cortex is also implicated. It shrinks in size as well. And that part of the brain is really needed for decision making, right? And reasoning. And those are also things that we want to see in our children and adolescents. So, and I can go on for longer periods, but I don't have that much time left. What I want to say here is that, you know, the changes in the brain structure have considerable implications for learning and behavioral outcomes that are of concern to all of the teachers that I've worked with over the years, and ultimately to folks in our community. Now, the good news is that the future is unwritten. I believe that was a song. I'm going to steal that phrase. The future is unwritten. You know, many of the ACEs result in feelings of insecurity and instability, but if we build the right systems, the right classrooms, the right schools, the right practices and policies, students with those environments can feel safe and secure. And in that environment where they're feeling safe and secure, there isn't as much of a need to guard against threats to self, right? So that amygdala doesn't need to be active, that hippocampus can grow, the prefrontal cortex can grow. The child can learn, right? And that's what we really need. And so I think to help along that process, it helps to teach kids how to be mindful of their states so that they know how to activate the types of strategies that are helpful to them so that they can keep the lid on so that they can focus on learning. So I want to just shift one last slide here. Thank you. So to do this, right, all the things that I'm talking about to build that environment, first, educators in schools need to shift away from individual level only interventions like harsh punishment, which we know disproportionately and negatively impacts people of color, Black and brown kids in particular. We need a systems approach, right, where policies and practice, the culture itself is shifted to support kids in their development. We need teachers and school administrators to understand the effects of trauma on the brain, and more importantly, how to work in concert to improve behavioral and learning outcomes for youth. And that takes intentionality. It takes a focus on all the different things that you're going to be hearing today: teacher wellness, building systems that are sustainable. So, you know, we can't just focus on kids and teaching them how to cope and be mindful. We need to do more than that. It's not sufficient to just focus on that level. It's kind of like, you know, giving a person with a broken leg a walking stick without mending and securing the leg with a cast and expecting them to walk real fast, right? It's just not going to happen. We need to be real intentional to provide the right types of supports. So I'm going to stop there and answer questions later on if needed.
Thank you so much, Chris, for setting such a strong foundation for why this work is so important. And just want to pull up why systems approach and a culture and climate approach, particularly in schools, is just so important. You said that so beautifully. I'm sure folks are going to have lots of questions in the Q&A towards the end of this presentation. And now I want to introduce Dr. Elise Schumacher, Assistant Director of Special Programs and Services with Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit 21, who's one of our intermediate units. I know is maybe new language, but one of our PA Department of Education regional hubs, which I think many of you across the country have something similar and maybe call it something similar. And Lisa is going to be walking you through the amazing work her team is doing in trauma-informed schools training.
Great. Thank you, Beth. So you're probably asking, as Beth said, what is an intermediate unit and how did the Carbon Lehigh Intermediate Unit get involved with Resilient Lehigh Valley? So we are a regional coordinating agency that brings together diverse school districts, career and technical schools, businesses, and community groups with the purposes of really facilitating inter-district cooperation and providing services, both educational and administrative. So essentially, we serve as that link between the Pennsylvania Department of Ed and our school systems. So most states do have some form of an educational agency that might be comparable to us. In Pennsylvania, we have 29 and we're numbered. We just happen to be Intermediate Unit 21 for Carbon and Lehigh counties. And how we got involved with Resilient Lehigh Valley, it started with a Safe Schools, Healthy Students grant in 2011. And our goal was to come up with some sort of wraparound program for our students in our emotional support center-based schools. And as a result of the work we did, we collaborated with a lot of agencies with drug and alcohol issues, law enforcement agencies, mental health agencies, and we did extensive work with Resilient Lehigh Valley. And it really was Resilient Lehigh Valley and these agencies that connected us to the importance of trauma-informed principles, and trauma-sensitive schools is where we took off with this. So although the grant ended in 2017, we continued our commitment at the IU by hiring 2 teachers to train schools in this area. And we continued in our partnership with Resilient Lehigh Valley to make sure we were offering the best of the best training. Next slide. So as with any work we do, it's important to have a common language when we're considering development of trauma-informed practices in schools. This slide is really a representation of the trauma-informed values that have been collectively created by experts in trauma-informed practices across the state of Pennsylvania. Now, the rationale for this is to create an understanding and common language that can be used within districts when addressing topics related to trauma-informed practices. So although you see these broad overarching values, it really is important to note that trauma-informed practices and trauma-sensitive schools, it's not a program. It is not a curriculum. If you look closely at these values, all of them really do align a lot with other initiatives that are in place in districts. That would include things like school climate improvement, school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports, social and emotional learning, restorative practices, and school safety. Next slide. Keep in mind when we're talking about trauma-sensitive schools and trauma-informed practices, there's a couple things to remember that are listed here. So without a doubt, reading on grade level according to standards is critical to student outcomes. After all, schools continue to be measured by testing scores, including students' ability to read according to grade level standards. However, as Chris noted, we have a crisis that must be addressed if we really want to succeed to getting students to read on grade level. We really need to address youth mental health and trauma due to its impact on students' ability to read and learn. So there's a few key points for schools. They are listed here, but keep in mind that fundamentally safety does precede learning, and that fear and anxiety will override cognitive capacities for students. Environment and activities can calm or escalate students, and relationships truly can heal. I think it's Brene Brown that says it really is our responsibility to heal, because otherwise an unfair circumstance becomes an unlived life. And that's what we're talking about. The other key thing to remember with all of this is that no two people experience the same events in the same way. We all have different upbringings, values, and supports. You can't really predict for someone what is traumatic and what is not. The next slide. There's so many benefits to becoming a trauma-informed school, and one of the best is that it aligns with many areas of school climate. So we have research that has shown improvements in academic achievement, school climate, and people's sense of safety at school. Increases in safety really truly allow staff and students to be calmer and develop stronger relationships with one another. So we can all recognize that students are willing to work harder, and they might be more tolerant in working with staff that they have a good rapport with. Trauma-informed educators as well also have a better understanding about behavior, and they're less likely to be reactive. They're more likely to be responsive, and there's a difference. They view behavior as a form of communication, which then can be used to identify a skill deficit or an area that is just lagging or falling behind. So in that case, a kid with a head down may not be viewed as boredom or laziness, but it might show that the student's tired from struggling with nightmares or really just working hard to keep it all together during this school day. And educators who are trauma informed are more likely to get to the root of the problem and come up with viable solutions for the future. Slide. How do you become trauma informed? You aim for a universal response. You move from trauma awareness to trauma sensitive to trauma responsive. So when you're aiming for a universal response, it means that all school staff members, all of them, from custodians up to the principal and the superintendent, they recognize and understand student responses to trauma. It also means that practices that support healing and resilience are embedded school-wide. It means schools ensure support for all students and enhance the identification of students with more intensive needs. Informed and trauma-sensitive schools encourage partnerships with community organizations to ensure that needed resources are available. So all of this in this slide means that it may require changes to your mission, to your vision, to your practices, to your policies, and to your culture. So again, it is not a canned program, and it is not a one-size-fits-all for school districts. It's a process. Next slide. So in Pennsylvania, we have multi-tiered systems of support. And this is just an example of how a trauma-sensitive school may play out. But MTSS is a framework that helps educators provide academic and behavioral strategies for students with various needs. So at Tier 1, this encompasses supports that are provided to all students in a school. You may see things like school-wide positive behavior intervention and supports, integration of SEL, calming corners or peace corners as they were referenced in the beginning video. They may be in every classroom. There may be a no bullying campaign. But if you look at this, you may have already recognized in your own work that Tier 1 supports do not always work for students who have experienced trauma. So then we move to Tier 2. And in Tier 2, that involves a closer examination of support and how we are working with students. So we're identifying those learning, those social, and those emotional skills that are lagging or lacking. We are supporting the development of them through various items that may be listed here on this slide. We are also reteaching any and all of the Tier 1 interventions, and we're taking a deeper look and examining the mental health supports that we have in place. Then we move to Tier 3. Tier 3 is really those individualized interventions for a select group of students. So things that we might include here in our wraparound services are a focus on trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. More crisis planning is done here. And as Chris talked about as well, examining those alternatives for suspensions and expulsions that seem to impact, that do impact our minorities a lot broader and a lot harder than some of our other students. So taking a look at what are our alternatives? Are we really getting at the root cause of what's going on here? So next slide. So what does this mean for you, and how can you begin to look at putting this in place in your schools? Well, the CLIU has been actively involved with the United Way of the Greater Lehigh Valley, and specifically Resilient Lehigh Valley, since our Safe Schools, Healthy Students grant that I noted in my first slide back in 2011. And it's through our strong partnership with Resilient Lehigh Valley, as well as our regular advocacy sessions with local legislators at our state capitol, that the CLIU secured a grant from a local senator, Senator Pat Brown, to develop online trauma training that would be free to all educators across PA. So Senator Brown's office recognized that there's numerous school districts across PA that would not have access to solid evidence-based trauma-informed training, and provided funding so that our two resilient teachers could create high quality trauma training, and it could be provided free to all school districts across PA. Well, this training is now open to educators outside of PA, and it's free. The result is a free online module series entitled Empowering Schools to Become Trauma Informed. The series is based upon the most up-to-date research available on the topics discussed. It's housed and available via the Canvas learning platform, and it's self-paced. It covers a range of topics under the umbrella of trauma-informed practices. And each of the modules, of which there are 7, has a video that is about an hour long, and it has connected activities. Now, a person who signs up to take this only needs to complete 5 of the modules to become a facilitator, and the completion of the first 5 modules might take 10 to 15 hours. The next slide. There are unique product or project features here. We determined that the purpose of this series would be to train those in-house facilitators to provide high quality professional development to their own school communities about trauma, its impacts, and how to address them. After all, the members of a school community are the ones who know it best, and therefore professional development delivered by someone within that community can often be the most relevant. Trained facilitators, those who sign up for this course and complete it, get access to all of the materials upon completion, and then they turn around and re-deliver the trainings to their staff in a way that makes sense to their school community. So there's 3 ways to do it. They can just hit press and play, where they're showing the video and pausing it to lead the embedded activities. And that facilitator will already have done those activities during their own training, and they'll have a facilitator guide full of answer keys and tips to help guide them with their staff. The next way is to do some of the script or most of the script, but then do some ad-libbing in terms of inserting those specific and more community-specific information pieces into the training. And the final way would be to use the slide deck as well that's provided, but instead of reading the script, the facilitator still focuses on the key points in the notes in each slide and does the essential information, but then may find it easier to be more conversational and embed more community-specific information. Each of the modules includes a variety of engagement activities. And again, as I said, the facilitator will have everything they need for supporting these activities in their facilitator guide and anchor the learning to real life. Next slide. There's a lot in this slide if the animation works, but really essentially what you're seeing is that their participants will get a participant workbook. They'll have the module slides and the facilitator guide when they complete all of the first 5 modules. Modules 6 and 7 are bonus modules. Basically, we'll have everything they need to turn it around within their school settings. The topics covered in the course include foundations of trauma awareness, recognition of trauma's impact, trauma responsive classroom strategies, and train the facilitator, as well as wellness improvement as a trauma-informed sensitive approach, which you're going to hear about next from our next presenter. So the last slide. Oh, this is the animation showing you a little bit about the training itself. You get access, you can simply scan this QR code and it'll take you to a link to the online course in the Canvas learning platform. And our resiliency teachers and I will be monitoring the course and the participants who are able to complete it. Any questions that you may have as you take the course.
Thank you, Lisa. I know that was the most succinct we could ever try and do around not only this amazing resource, but, kind of the foundations of a trauma-informed school approach. And already, we have some questions popping up in the Q&A. Please keep typing in your questions. The questions that have already come in are pretty meaty. So instead of kind of doing a live response, we want to make sure there's enough time to share some of these other highlight projects that we want to share with you all that we think might be important for you to try and replicate in your own community. So we're going to answer all the questions that pop up in the Q&A session later. So please keep typing in those questions. Some good ones are already coming in. And thanks for sharing that amazing resource, Lisa. It really is something, and we've already shared it locally in our own community, but it's definitely something for educators. But I'll also say, any of your youth program providers would also find this hugely, hugely helpful. So it was designed for educators, but you can really think more broadly about the community providers and partners that could benefit from this resource. And I think a beautiful natural segue into our next presenter, Elise Jones, the amazing principal of Paxenosa Elementary School in the Easton Area School District, also one of our strongest best practice community schools that is also financially supported by Crayola. So they do a lot of amazing work with Crayola as a partner, corporate partner at Paxenosa. And Elise is going to be doing amazing work leading a trauma-informed school movement. So any questions about how to get that up and ready, Elise is ready to answer those. And she's done some amazing work in fostering staff wellness, which is just always important, has always been important, but I think given the last 2 years and rising rates of compassion fatigue and burnout amongst our educators, even more needed now than ever. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton over to Elise.
All right, thank you very much. And I'm so glad to be here with everyone. Just centering ourselves around this work, I think, is always refreshing. And it's great to see so many people out to listen and just get more involved in the trauma-informed school work. As Beth said, I do lead a trauma-informed school, also a community school, Paxenosa Elementary School. And I'm here really to talk about self-care and how we can take care of the staff that are working in these environments. So first, why should we care about self-care? And I think that, COVID has kind of brought out the need for that. But really important, we can't pour from an empty cup. And that's simple to say and harder maybe to visualize, but we can't do our best if we don't have what we need. And what we do know is adults often have their own traumatic histories, which can cause a well-meaning adult, and I truly mean that, a well-meaning adult, to respond personally to students or others when they get into an emotional state. And that behavior can be perceived as a personal threat. And you heard this earlier, but becoming a trauma-informed school and focusing on self-care means that we're changing that mindset, that behavior is communication. And that goes beyond student behavior. So adult behavior, as the leader of a trauma-informed school focusing on self-care, adult behavior also becomes communication. And as the leader, it is my job, along with my team's job, to find ways that we are going to meet the needs of our students and our staff. And I truly believe that our staff have amazing intentions and always want to do what's best for kids. But sometimes through continuous empathetic engagement with trauma survivors, they do experience traumatic stress, which can have a lot of different symptoms on themselves. And it can cause vicarious trauma, which is emotional residue from working with children and families with chronic stress and trauma. And that emotional residue can show up in a lot of ways in adults. It can look like having, being easily startled, being jumpy, maybe feeling trapped by your occupation. We've heard of a lot of educators leaving the field, anxiety, irritation, feeling hopeless, detached, and maybe having that physical, even spiritual exhaustion can show up as a symptom of that vicarious trauma. And a lot of educators and people working with children are experiencing compassion fatigue. And that results from a constant use of empathy when you have to respond to students who are experiencing trauma or have high ACEs. And COVID has certainly intensified the needs for self-care for our staff. And I'm really excited to share some ideas that I hope you can take with you to your organizations. Can go to the next slide. Okay, so where to start? I'll tell a little bit about our own journey at Paxenosa. Paxenosa is a large school. We have about 650 students. And through that, we have a large staff as well. So staff wellness needs to be put at the front. You're talking about, of course, students and their safety and their well-being, but who are the people that are ensuring that? it's your staff, and that has to be put to the forefront at all times. So it's really important to recognize the need to prioritize self-care at the individual, professional, and organizational level. So there's a lot of different things that can be done at the different levels. You have to strongly want to create an organizational climate that encourages self-care. And that desire has to be strong and has to be something you're passionate about if you're leading a school or an organization. And it really goes far beyond, a dress down day or a treat in your mailbox or some of those tangible things that they do feel good in the moment. But when you're really looking to change the climate that encourages self-care, it has to go beyond those things. It has to become routine, and it has to be built into the school setting or the school day. And it can't be an afterthought. And some benefits that, I have seen from implementing the things that I'm going to talk to you about here is staff retainment. So having fewer staff leave the building, or even asking to be transferred to other schools within the district. That has certainly improved from about 50% of the staff asking for a transfer when we first started this work to last year, less than 5%. Staff participation in activities and things that are going on in the building, and that true buy-in is up. And, almost every staff member is part of different committees that we're doing work and are really involved in all aspects of things going on at the school. And improvement in staff absences, and that's huge. So by implementing a true self-care program, you will see that, staff absences, it improves. It does get better. Can go to the next slide. So part of leading a self-care focused school is managing with compassion. And that really sounds easy, but takes a lot of work, because you have to be able to encourage your staff to have autonomy and be flexible and trust the professionals that you work with. And trust their judgment and their choice, and hear them. We have to help our employees manage change and provide opportunities for ongoing learning. So change is hard for all people, and scaffolding that change and providing professional development whenever change is coming is really important, especially if that change is going to be significant, and if it's coming at a high stress time, especially the beginning of the school year can be very stressful, holidays. There needs to be a lot of scaffolding and a lot of professional development whenever you're implementing change, when you're thinking about self-care. You need to help your employees find a sense of meaning in their work, and make sure staff are able to do what they love. We know they love working with kids, and that might not be enough. So how can you tap into their strengths to help them find a sense of meaning in their work, and find that sense of pride again? And then recognize and validate the challenges in the work. And, I do this by listening, meeting with my staff, making time for them to meet one-on-one, and really getting into their classrooms and seeing the challenges that they face every day. Okay, I think my next slide should have a video.
So here we are at the nurse's office at Paxinosa. We really focus on staff care here. We believe that self-care is super important for confidence, for self-esteem. Also trickles down to the children and the students, and they can realize that if you take care of yourself, you can do anything. We focus on providing blood pressure checks for our staff members, temperature checks. We have medications on board if they should need something, but staff care and wellness is very important here, and it's also very important for our mental health.
Trauma-informed schools, it is so important to make sure that we take care of ourselves as teachers, to have the self-care. One being, we have the Just Press Pause room, which you'll see later on in the video, which is fantastic. You're having a tough day, you have some students having some tough behaviors with whatever they came in with that particular day, and you want to be there for them and make sure you give your all. We need to make sure we re-energize ourselves. So going in that room, massage chairs, that will help.
I would like to toast to all of your hard work, your commitment, your persistence, and your unwavering support for our PAC students. I know that this job is not easy and that you take a lot of things home with you every day, but I couldn't have asked for a better staff here to support this community and these students.
Kate Riley, I'm the school psychologist at Paxenosa, and this is part of our Just Press Pause room, which is available to all of our staff members. It's kind of the adult version of a common corner, if you want to think about it that way. We have a massage chair here. There are lots of small areas, so you can have a few people in here at a time. The idea is that it's an opportunity for staff to, take some time away if they're either stressed from things at home or things that are happening in the classroom. We're supposed to have no electronics down here, so it's just your time to center yourself. You can use the massage chair. There's some other chairs and weighted blankets.
I can just summarize since we're having some technical difficulties, if you guys can hear me. You just want to pause it. So what you're seeing on the screen is just our pause room is what we call it. And it's kind of evolved since this video was taken. It's taken shape this year into 2 spaces, but essentially what it is an area where our staff can go, and it's open all the time. It has massage chairs, diffusers, calming music. I also provide coffee, a water bottle filling station, and lots of just calming atmosphere. And then also like plants, whether I'm not have such a green thumb, but I do have staff that find taking care of plants or other things is very calming. So it's just an area in the school where it's always available to staff to go take a break if they need it. Like you were going into a part, and I'm not sure if you could hear it or not, but there was my school psychologist just explaining that we have calm corners in all of our classrooms for our students, but this is also now an area, more of a calm room for staff that they can access. And how is it used? That's always a great question that I get. So it's used in a lot of different ways. It's used, a lot of staff like to go there first thing in the morning before they start their day. Some staff like to use it on their prep or their lunch, some at the end of the day. We also have the availability that if we notice as an admin team that there are staff that are, feeling overwhelmed or stressed, since we have a designated area, we can recommend using that space, or sometimes mentor teachers will ask a newer teacher, like, let's go take a break. Let's go see how we can manage this stress or this feeling. So it can be used in a lot of different ways. I do also, if we see that people are not using it a lot, we might, add in some treats down there one day and really maybe try to entice people to use it. So this was all funded through a Healthy Staff, Happy Staff initiative and grant. So we did get funding from our local businesses and a lot of different partners that we were able to get this room together. And it was actually for a community challenge, for a room challenge, but then to maintain it, there was some grant funding. But along with this room, so the room is just not enough. I think the room is a great step if it's something a school or an organization can provide. But you also have to think of a well-rounded program that focuses on health, regulation, time and space, and some self-exploration and actualization. Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat and talk, and that's not working for me. So our health program, we have done nutrition classes for staff, yoga classes, and various fitness classes, weightlifting, Zumba. For regulation, our staff have participated in mindfulness, social emotional learning. We practice a lot of movement and stillness with our staff. We make sure we plan, we give time and space to these activities. So they're pre-planned and happening as much as they can during the school day. So staff are not expected to stay beyond the school day or come in early. And again, a lot of the outcomes that we're seeing are staff that are able to better handle students who are not emotionally regulated because their own emotions are regulated and they have that support system and that self-care.
Thanks, Elise. I imagine we already had some questions and ideas popping up in the chat, so feel free to respond to folks there. And maybe we circle back up to some of that in the Q&A towards the end. And I think it's a great segue, from talking about staff resiliency and how we build staff resiliency to, how we continue to support youth and family resiliency. So I want to introduce Ashi Singh, the Director of Data Impact at our United Way, and also former Resilient Lehigh Valley AmeriCorps Vista, who's going to talk through some of our efforts with some family wellness kits and student emotional regulation kits.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. So pre-COVID, we had this plan we had a grant and we had a plan to dole out these wellness sort of tools to schools. But post-COVID, we know that a lot of families were indoors. A lot of times, some families lost their jobs or some parents lost their jobs. And then there was high levels of stress. There was high levels of trauma. So with that, we decided to reallocate some of the grant funded money that we got into these kits. And what you'll see on this photo is the information that are the tools and things that we gave them. And some of what we did was we really wanted to help students emotionally regulate when they feel upset, stressed, or anxious. And then with COVID closing the schools and the district transitioning to virtual learning, we quickly shifted this resource from classroom-based to home-based resources. And we created 500 Creating Calm kits for families. So with this kit, we also, on our website, we worked with a partner named Shanti, and we created Creating Calm together. And it was basically this online resource so that way families could practice mindfulness together. They could teach each other or learn from each other and understand each other's feelings and talk about big emotions and things like that. So we did this for families, and we also did this because we understood that during COVID, everybody was experiencing high stress levels. So we understood that we wanted to give families an outlet and a way to practice mindfulness and a way to reduce the stress inside the home, because we also recognized that during COVID, there were high rates of or higher chances and higher rates of child abuse. So we wanted to provide families with an outlet, a healthy outlet that would be useful to them. So one of the things you'll see in this photo is this emotional wellness plan. So it was something that we created for families to do together with their kids. So that way in a time of high stress, they had a plan of what they could do together to reduce stress and to create a happier, healthier environment. So after these family wellness kits were given out, we also, still with that same grant money, we decided to do another 2,000 kits for schools in our full service community schools. So we created similar kits. In the next photo, you'll see that you'll see some of the items we put in those kits. So that was specifically for these community schools. And then we had the same intention where we would provide students with an outlet because they were coming back from COVID. There were still high stress levels. If any of you remember coming back to work after COVID, we still were a little bit unsure. We were still afraid. We were still, I guess, anxious and nervous. And sometimes when we came back from COVID, We also had exacerbated symptoms of possibly depression or anxiety, things like that. So one of the benefits to doing this that we found was it teaches children a way to express their big emotions in healthy ways. And with the family calming kits, we really wanted there to be healthy modeling. So we had that as another benefit. And then we wanted to increase self-awareness and knowledge of feelings. So if students and children had better understanding of their feelings, then they could better express them, and they could better share those feelings with a caring adult, and then they could work together and work through those big emotions. And so when big feelings are addressed, as we've kind of talked about, children can focus on school. So as you know, Chris and Lisa have talked about, when we address those big feelings, then we are able to kind of work through issues and then help them focus on school. So those were the benefits. I think that's it.
Yeah, thanks, Ashi. So I was listening and chatting and typing at the same time. Thank you for that, Ashi. And I will say that it was not environmentally friendly with the amount of plastic in creating those kits. So that's one of the downsides to the kits, but really received very positively the student kits in lieu of the peace room, right? Because of COVID and sharing materials, we did the individual kits, really well received by the students and families. And similarly, the resources we share with families also really, really well received by families there. And in partnership with Lehigh University and IU21 and two other providers, including a mindfulness provider, we created a video series called Creating Calm Together that we directed families to that had videos showing breathing exercises, mindfulness exercises, kindness building, and social emotional learning building, different activities you can be doing as families together. So and honestly, with COVID and everything being closed, that was our best thinking at the time, but well received by families. So thanks for walking through all of that, Ashi. And the last thing we want to share before opening up to Q&A is a pretty powerful collaborative program called Handle with Care. And want to introduce our Handle with Care team, our dream team here. We have Monica Georges, a community activist and our former grant coordinator that helped to lift up Handle with Care. Claire Hogan, Chief Pupil Services with the Bethlehem Area School District, one of our key community school partners, and Chief Michelle Cott with the City of Bethlehem Police Department. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Georges, and as Beth said, I was a PCCD grant coordinator. The Handle with Care program is one of the projects that I managed. So 2 years ago, we launched the Regional Handle with Care program, a very simple communication system for police officers to notify schools when a child had experienced a traumatic event. Many times the children will show up to school and the teachers were unaware that they had experienced something, and many times those experiences took place either at home or in the community. So as they show up to school and the teachers are not aware, they're only seeing a change in their mood or in their behavior, and sometimes that led to negative consequences for the students. And we had already begun the trainings for trauma-informed, following the trauma-informed school model, as it was mentioned earlier, when we were made aware of this program, of the Handle with Care program that was started in West Virginia in response to the opioid crisis that was devastating their families and impacting their schools. The pilot program was funded by a state grant, and we brought together our police, our schools, and the district attorneys to review the program and to determine together in a collaborative way how to build this program and how it would work in our community.
So I think segueing over to Chief Cott.
Hi, thanks, Monica. And it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. So what good does it serve for law enforcement to participate in this program? This program is important because it puts our children first. Dr. Lang spoke about the ACEs and how toxic stress affects our children and how that can result in substance abuse later in life, health problems, behavioral issues. So rather than trying to arrest our way out of society's problems, we're focusing on developing and supporting our children with our community partners. The program is easy for law enforcement to participate in. Officers responding to the scene of a traumatic event are trained to make a handle with care referral when a school-age child or teen is present. Some examples of incidents that can be traumatic for children and teens are car accidents, the overdose of a family member, a suicide or suicide attempt, domestic disputes, or the arrest of a loved one. Referrals take about 7 to 10 seconds. To make a referral, officers click a link built into our report management system, which will take them to the Handle with Care form located on the Safe to Say Something PA platform. An officer need only enter the student's name, school, the officer's agency, badge number, and the date of the traumatic incident. That's it. No confidential information is shared. Just a simple message to our partners at the school district to handle that child with care and show them some grace that day at school. So during the pilot program, the Bethlehem Police Department had 68 Handle with Care referrals. However, that following year, we doubled that. BPD had 148 referrals, and we're extremely optimistic about this program and that we'll have even more in the future as officers become more familiar with the program. And here to talk a little bit more about the involvement from the school district is Claire Hogan.
Good afternoon, everybody. If we can go to the next slide, please. And then the next slide. Perfect, thank you. As Beth said, I'm Claire Hogan. I'm the Chief Pupil Service Officer for Bethlehem Area School District. And we have been on the ground beginning with Handle with Care. And I think the most important thing that I can say to you today is that it identifies the kids most at risk as early as possible, that we can provide the supports that are necessary for that child based upon the experience that they had. It provides teachers with a heads up about the student's needs, that there was a traumatic experience that this child was involved with. As Chief Cott said, we have no idea what the event was, but we just know that there was some type of traumatic involvement, that event that child was involved with. It equips the schools with tips on creating the safe and supportive learning environments. It connects children with the supports that they need. Now, a lot of people say, well, what type of supports do you provide? Well, it could be as simple as providing a safe space for that child to just put their head down, take some time to sleep a little bit, provide them some food, depending on that they didn't have any food or something to drink from the event. It could be that the child needs some extended time for the test or an assignment to complete, or we eliminate a test, but it's providing that child what they need. Handle with Care has also, we've seen, it strengthens and improves the relationships and communication between the law enforcement and our school personnel. It provides a positive impact and helps build the relationship between that family, as well, not just with the school, but also with the law enforcement. It also equips the law enforcement officers to be sensitive to impact of the trauma on the youth at the scene. And as we stated before, it ultimately, Handle with Care allows the teachers to implement and to reinforce the trauma-informed practices that we put into place, into action, that allows the support to the students to get through that traumatic experience based upon what they need at that specific time in the classroom. It may be that day, it may be the next day, it could be 2 weeks down the road, but we're ready to provide that support because we know that that child has had that experience. But most importantly, it sends the message, whether it be through the law enforcement or whether it's from the school side, that we truly do care and we want the student to be successful emotionally, physically, but ultimately successful. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Monica.
So one of the things that we did in helping to support and make people aware, particularly the police departments and our teachers aware of the program. On the next slide, you'll see the tip cards that were created. Both, so there were cards, and then there was also stickers that we created for the officers' laptops. And then we also created this one sheeter just for teachers, and it basically just helped them to know what they should look out for and how to respond once they're made aware of a handle with care referral for a particular student. And all the resources related to the Handle with Care program and what we developed here in the Lehigh Valley community can be found on the Resilient LV website, resilientlehighvalley.org website. And you could just click on the Handle with Care tab and find everything there. So just to kind of piggyback off of what Chief Cott had mentioned, she'd mentioned what the Bethlehem City Police Department, the referrals that they submitted in the time frame that we, from the launch of the program to our second year. And so in our first pilot year, we received a total of 225 referrals across both counties, the Lehigh and Northampton County. And in year 2, we received 574 Handle with Care referrals, and that's an increase of 150%. So over time, we've started to see more of our police departments engaged in the program and making sure that these referrals are submitted to our schools. And more importantly, more children are getting the support that they need when they arrive at school. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Monica, Claire, and Chief Cott. Handle with Care is a very simple communication mechanism. Again, doesn't violate any confidence, any information sharing laws that probably exist within your communities, within law enforcement. And yet a really, really powerful program that really supports students most impacted by trauma, and continues to help equip educators, right, to really provide those kind of safe, nurturing, healing-centered relationships and environments that can not only help a child heal, but really can help a child, succeed in school as well. So with our last few minutes, I do want to get back to some of the questions folks dropped in the Q&A. And I know some questions have been going through the chat with our panelists responding, which is awesome. Some really, really cool conversation to happen in the chat. So Malaya, I don't know if that's getting recorded or shared or some of the resources and references. Love Dr. Ginwright. We had him speak in our community as well. So maybe if you want to speak at the end to like how we can share some of these resources shared in the chat out with folks, that'd be great. And do want to get to some of the questions folks have. So we have one from Pilar. Haven't seen the connection between universal approaches and being trauma responsive. Can you explain the rationale for the connection and why targeted programs are not the ideal? So this question maybe is for either Chris, Claire, or Elise, maybe? Does one of you want to take a crack at a response?
Hi, I'm not quite sure exactly the focus of the question, but with the trauma informed school approach, it is a 3-tiered system. So there are universal approaches that are designed for everyone. Focusing on teacher well-being is a tier 1 approach. As we focus on the climate of the school with respect to their well-being, and also to
the racial climate of the building, we are focusing on a universal approach, right? And there are also other examples of universal approaches that each of the schools engage in. But there are also, tier 2 and tier 1 approaches. So some students will, need a little bit more attention. And the hope is to build out more tier 2 types of interventions to complement the existing ones, so that students can benefit from culturally responsive and anti-racist approaches at that tier. And then also, and this is going to be a little bit more of the challenging tier, just because of the shortage of mental health professionals out there in the community, at least in ours. But for individuals who need additional attention, they're identified and referred for those services. Now, one of the things that we talk to our school partners about is the importance of, having an effective system. So it's not just knowing that there are tiers, but that there's a process that they need to really adhere to and follow, that students who are identified as being in need of some additional supports are actually tracked and given the opportunity to grow through those additional approaches. In this multi-tiered systems approach, we're also communicating to schools that this shouldn't be an excuse to engage in further victim blaming. Like, so if a child doesn't succeed at the tier 2 or tier 3 level, it's not right for schools to just fix more blame on the individual or the family, or worse, the community. It's to help the schools understand that maybe there's something in the process that may not be helpful to the child, right? So it's to help the schools understand that the tiered system is only as helpful as it can be if the teachers are willing to engage in the conversations, right, from a race-sensitive, trauma-informed approach. I hope I answered the question. I'm not sure I did, but it's not or, it's both. It's both and.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think that's really, really important. And I know we're at 1:56, so I think time to wrap up the Q&A. And so I'll pass it over to Malay. And I'm hoping with the questions that are still remaining that we haven't got to, we can add responses back to the to a follow-up email, so we're not leaving any questions unanswered, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Our chat has been on fire, and we have lots of really great questions. So I do want to make that note that anything that we have not answered live in the session, we will be connecting back with those questions that have come up. We have a way to record those and make sure that those are answered in the follow-up resources that we'll send out to everybody who attended today. So I want to send that note out. We do have a final poll question too before we wrap up. And so I'm hoping that Sierra can please post that poll before we end today. It's just a question that we would love to hear from all of you. This poll question really ties in with everything that we have just heard from the team from Lehigh Valley about the various roles that schools play in the lives of children. This past summer, we did reach out to 600 plus local state partners who've joined our webinars as presenters, and also nearly 400 individuals with some themes. And we asked for feedback on these 3 silver linings that became themes for the campaign for grade level reading that we've identified as emerging from the pandemic. We heard a strong endorsement from groups about how they are eager to see what's resonating with our September webinar attendees, which is you all today. So this is what we're wanting to ask you. So please feel free to answer live. Is recognition of schools as an essential child-serving agency, which support both children's welfare and the nation's economic infrastructure, along with their role as places of teaching and learning, to be considered a silver lining of the pandemic? Agree or disagree? So just go ahead and answer that live. And I want to just extend a thank you to everybody who participated as a panelist. This was a really powerful 90 minutes that went a little bit too quickly. Absolutely, all of the resources will be sent out, and we can definitely have transcript of the chat. Imani, I'm just responding to your comment there. We have one more slide to end on today, which is just a note about upcoming webinars that are will be coming. There's one this afternoon if if you have time. So I just appreciate everybody being here this afternoon. Thank you, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.